All right. So, hi to all the residents at Glacier Hills. I'm here with Ed Hoffman of Wham Radio's Speaking of Art today.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. It is a true pleasure and to be back with you and all the residents there at Glacier Hills.
All right, so I will dive right in here with the first piece that we're going to discuss today. So this piece is called number 116, Antigua, British West Indies. This was done by Richard Wilt, who we talked a little bit about in our last 5 Easy Pieces presentation.
Yes.
This was done in 1960, and it's a watercolor painting. So Richard Wilt was on the faculty at the University of Michigan in the art department there. And so this piece was actually done on sabbatical. He took a 6-month sabbatical to Antigua, where he was just exploring new methods of creating artwork and producing a lot of new pieces. And so with those sabbatical projects they were doing at the time, the more STEM-focused professors at U of M were required to write up a report of their work and their findings after they returned here. And they determined that that wouldn't quite work for the arts side of the faculty. So rather than doing a report, they would come back and put on an exhibition of the work that they had completed while on sabbatical. So this piece is actually one of the ones that was done on site in Antigua. There are several hundred of these pieces. You can see this is number 116 of the collection. And these were kind of used as studies. And when he returned back stateside, he continued to work with these themes and do more finalized versions in his studio based off of what he had done there. So this actually is an interesting example of a technique that he was trying to develop called instant imaging, where rather than painting with a paintbrush, he would lay the paper horizontally and apply the pigment to the paper with a lot of water, and
Yes.
then he would lay pieces of foliage directly in the pigment to create kind of a direct impression of that piece of foliage. And so you can kind of see the impressions of the different leaves and botanical pieces that he used. And then you can see he went back through and added outlines to kind of make it a bit more clear what it was he was trying to display there.
Sarah, as far as you know, was this a technique that he perfected during that long sabbatical? I can't think of a better place to go for 6 months, I'll tell you, to Antigua. But had he sort of worked in this style prior to going, or was he so inspired by the island that it just lent itself to this to give it the most impactful experience that you could? I mean, the fact that you've got the tracery of the actual plants there, it almost becomes kind of like a fossil or some sort of something from natural history, as well as a work of art. It's like a collage in a way, or an imprint of actual plant life.
Yeah, as far as I know, this was his first experiment with this technique. I think he did a little bit more. There was a second sabbatical that he did in Maine, where he was kind of dealing with the same ideas, but obviously with a very different collection of natural materials there. It's a very different environment. But I think this was his main exploration into this technique. And in his little write-up, I actually was able to read the text that he provided in his one-man show when he returned back to Ann Arbor. And he said that he was trying to find an answer to the question of whether the newest way of doing something is necessarily the best way of doing something, or whether there's merit to the traditions that have lasted throughout the centuries. So this was his foray into a new way of capturing an image. And he didn't actually provide an answer to that question. I'm not sure what his final takeaway was of whether this was superior to, doing an interpretation of what he was looking at with a paintbrush. But it's a really neat experiment, in my opinion. I love what you said about fossils there. It actually, the bits in the lower right-hand corner remind me a lot of Petoskey stones, actually.
You're absolutely right. That scaling. That was one thing that impressed me about it, Sarah, very, very much. Everybody is probably, you get the, even though this is a dried work, it's a finished work, you get the feeling it's being done right in front of you. I mean, can you imagine the water that was on this? He let it sit. If he's doing it like an Asian artist, like a Chinese artist, he's on a flat surface and he's painting on that. And it's almost like it took forever maybe for this to dry. It doesn't have that sort of a wet, almost as if you're looking at the leaves underwater almost in a way. Do you think, did you hear that? I think we might have had a little bit of an interruption. Did you hear much of what I just said?
Yes, I did,
You
actually.
did.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that you can really see the process in the finished product there. It does look like it's something that has been soaked in water and left to dry out in the sun, which is a really cool way of bringing back, working on site, directly dealing with what he's interacting with in this new, strange place. And I feel like we get that connection ourselves because we know that what he was looking at actually made contact with this paper and created the
Mhm.
image there.
You know, one thing that is a takeaway for me, Sarah, from this is I think of other artists who sort of like started up north, right? Like Winslow Homer, again in Maine, or a Martin Johnson Heade from New England salt marshes. Even Renoir, one of the great founding impressionists in the Ile-de-France around Paris and all that. These people ended up going south. Frederick Edwin Church also. And they are absolutely amazed by the light, with Renoir going to Algiers, South America for Church. Heade, think of those wonderful orchids in Brazil. And same thing, Wilt here. His main, well, you said that the main sojourn happened later, but that's interesting. They seem to like this dichotomy of the colder clime and then the warm. And I think we're kind of like experiencing, that warm Gulf sort of climate, that environment in this work.
Absolutely. I was reading as well on the Maine trip, he brought his wife and daughter along with him, and they lived in a tent the entire 6 months. So I like to think that his family might have enjoyed the Antigua trip a little more.
Oh my God, that's funny. Oh, I bet he had a copy of Thoreau's The Maine Woods with
Yeah,
him. I'll bet for that. It seems like he's trying to live it. Wow. That's a
absolutely.
beautiful work. That is a
And
beautiful. By the way, I'm working on a Wilt piece for an appraisal, currently.
wow.
And it's a very, very interesting piece. It's basically kind of like this, almost like a collage, but it's basically a double image of the Prima Porta Augustus. So that wonderful early first century AD great statue. I think it's in the Vatican collections of the Augustus of Prima Porta, where it was dug up, I guess, his consort Livia's country house. And it's always become, since then, the greatest representation of the Emperor Augustus. And it's that, but done in kind of a monochromatic way twice. Very, very, it really is like a piece of pop art in a way. So he's a very innovative artist. I like his work. We're very lucky the fact that he went to the U of M. He was a faculty member there, and we have so much of his work in this area.
Agreed. I don't think I've seen two pieces of his work that looks even remotely the same. He was extremely diverse.
Great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
And I also provided this little comparison here. So on the left, you see a detail of the Wilt piece, which I think is probably the most distinctive impression of foliage. That little bit, they almost look like ferns, although they're
Yes, they
probably not.
do.
And on the right, I've compared it to this early cyanotype photograph done by Anna Atkins, who is trying to capture, she had this extensive
Oh,
seaweed collection, And so she wanted to commemorate her collection in a book. And so this is actually a direct contact image as well. She would lay the seaweed directly on paper that had been treated to react to light. And so what was opaque, the light couldn't shine through and therefore would show up as white. And then the light would develop the cyan tone around it. And I thought that was a really interesting comparison, almost 100 years or more than 100 years earlier, of somebody trying out the same exact concept of directly capturing the image of foliage.
Absolutely, and it dovetails so beautifully, Sarah, with the 19th century's just fascination with the natural world. You know, if we're leading up to the voyages of the Beagle and to Darwin and the origin of species and all this, I mean, so many people were involved with this. It just wasn't people we would consider scientists. They seemed to be artists, explorers, whatever they happened to be. If they came in contact with the natural world, there was almost this obsession to sort of categorize it, right? And to break it down and to understand their world. And science becoming art in this way. And I think Atkins's father was a chemist, wasn't he? I mean, she was schooled in science, I think, to be able to do this so early.
Yes, and a lot of her social circle was very interested in early photographic techniques. So it was something that she had a lot of access to, but some consider her the first female photographer in history. And so she was really taking from the people around her and innovating with that new technology.
It's absolutely fascinating. I love the passage that you captured, you know, for the illustration for the Antigua by Wilt. That is a very dramatic corner of that painting. It's wonderful. I was going to say, if I were looking at it for the first time, I didn't know what it was, I'd say it's a fish tank that needs to be cleaned.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually took me a few times walking past it in the corridor before I stopped to give it a second look and realized, oh, this is a Richard Wilt. And so then I gave it a second look and realized how intricate and unusual it was. And the more I found out about the technique he was using, the more it all snapped into place. Oh, that's what I'm looking at here.
You know, one thing that our audience might be thinking of, Sarah, is that there seem to be maybe parallels with Wilt's techniques and ceramics in a way, where you really never know what it's going to look like when it really comes out. You can sort of like put it together and then you let that wonderful chance take place. I'm wondering how much of this was, you know, that he understood and conceptualized before he actually, you know, committed everything, you know, to the paper. It seems like there was a fair amount of chance to get this almost 19th century, you know, end paper kind of look of books at that time with that marvelous oil design effect. There seems to be an element of chance to it, but I'm not really sure to what degree.
Yeah, it's interesting that he had put enough thought into this new technique to even pose the question of, will this be better than what we've been doing up until this point to capture an image of foliage?
Yes.
And the fact that he had his own doubts about whether this would be the best way of doing things leads me to think there was a lot of experimentation going on there.
That's neat. It's kind of neat also the way you describe the paradigm shift with the university for their artist faculty, that we can't have them write something up. They've got to create something. We're going to have basically a salon exhibition. And that was, I think that's very interesting, which they've been doing ever since.
Yes, and actually several of the artists that we're looking at today in this program actually put on their own faculty shows, just like Richard Wilt did, which I found completely by accident while I was going through the records at the Bentley Historical Library. I was specifically looking for information on this piece, and lo and behold, I found all of these exhibition guides for all of these other artists that I had in my queue to research. I said, oh, they were all in the same place at the same time, doing the same thing.
They all knew one another. That's
Yeah,
exciting. That's wow. Well, it's a beautiful, beautiful work of art.
absolutely. All right, let's transition to our second piece here. So this is another one of those faculty artists who had their own one-man show at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, Albert Mullen. And
Yes.
Albert Mullen is of particular interest because a year ago, when we did our first 5 Easy Pieces presentation, we included a floral still life painting that we could not decipher the signature of. And uh,
No.
so much time passed, I thought that it might have said C. Miller. It was very clearly dated, but the signature I just couldn't make out enough to attach to any artists that I knew of. And one day I was passing through the corridors and saw this painting and thought, oh, that signature looks familiar. And so I turned it over, and on the back, he signed his name much more clearly than he does on the front side of his works. And so I was able to identify Albert Mullen, University of Michigan faculty member, as the artist of this piece and that floral still life that we looked at a year ago.
That's incredible. I mean, again, Sarah, like the wilt, I mean, these are artists who really were able to expand. I mean, the floral still life is beautiful. The muted colors are lovely. I think I guess that's a watercolor. I can't remember, but
Yes, it
this is
was.
so different. This is almost like a color field piece from that from that same period. Even mid '60s. I'm thinking of Litsky and all those. This is a very vibrant, gorgeous piece. Very, very different from the other.
Absolutely. It's much less figurative, very, very abstract. Albert Mullen himself did his own sabbatical to Mexico, and
Mhm.
I was reading, he did all of these very naturalistic, figurative sketches while he was down there. And when he got back to the United States, he just hated them all. And so all of the pieces that he did working off of those sketches ended up being very, very abstract and expressive, like this one, very based on color and feeling and brushstroke.
That's neat. I love that. He sort of rejected the au plein air of the Barbizon artists and the Impressionists and said, okay, it's too academic. I've got to get the feeling in it. And he even writes about that. The fact that you dug that up at the Bentley was amazing, Sarah. I read the page, zoomed in a little bit more on it, and getting his thoughts about how he rejected his drawings on the spot, but basically the sort of holistic feeling of what Mexico meant to him when he was there, and those colors and what he saw. I love the way, if I could, just for a moment, the way that you um, quoted this with the material that you initially sent me. I love the way that you said it looks arbitrary, yet there is an order to it. Uh, and you're absolutely right. It does look arbitrary, almost like a Pollock in a way. But you're right. It's almost in different registers. There is an order to it, and the blue is absolutely fantastic. A cobalt kind of blue, and then the yellows and the russet colors at the top, and then that almost like Hans Hofmann over on the left. These swaths of, you almost feel like you want to eat them. And I don't have pica or anything like that. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, I look at this and it's something you almost want to put your finger on, thinking it's icing on a cake.
Mm.
That left side of the piece, it is a beautiful work.
Absolutely. And I was able to dig up as well some information on, he gave many, many lectures to the students of the University of Michigan on the modern artists. He began his work around the 40s and was moving through the 60s. And so he was working right at the same time as all of those true modernists like Pollock, as you mentioned. And the way he would describe their work, I thought was really beautiful. Let me find the quote here. Let's see. Yes, he characterized modern art with freedom of form, dramatization of space, and expression of the artist. And I think that those are three elements that we really see in this piece.
Hey, that's really incredible. Sarah, from our experience doing Five Easy Pieces, at this point, do you think that we could actually make an argument, say, for these art faculty members, almost an Ann Arbor school at this point, or would you say that their styles are so disparate and all that that we can't really do it? But as you say, they all knew one another. So I'm just wondering whether there's a little bit more categorization that we could really give them, shed a little bit more light on them as a group. Is that going in the right direction or not?
Absolutely. I think there are so many really prominent faculty members working right around the middle of the 20th century there who all knew one another. It's when I look up one of them on the internet, I find an obituary written by another one of them celebrating their colleague and fellow artist.
Yeah,
And they all were, I think, were working and developing their techniques and interacting with one another, even if their pieces look completely different when you put them side by side. I think absolutely there was a cohort happening.
that's one. I love his experiences at our Mullins in Mexico. He said it was a pretty heady experience. I'm paraphrasing, for someone like North to come down to Mexico and to be bombarded with indigenous culture, with, I think what he said, if I remember correctly, a veneer of Mexican civilization and the influence of the government, but really close to the surface were the enduring traditions. And he felt very humbled, I think, being in the company of that, the fabulous colors, the art, the crafts, the people he was meeting. It really was an epiphany for him.
Absolutely, and you even see a lot of the traditional Mexican abstraction of pattern and color happening here, with an artistic spin placed on it, absolutely, but you can see the influence come through there.
It's beautiful. It's very contemplative in a way. It's exciting in its way, but overall it has like a transcendent feel, almost like an icon, an object for meditation in front of, in a way.
Absolutely, and I love the fact that something that looks so spontaneous actually had a lot of forethought and planning put into it.
Good point. That's a very good point. I think that confuses people a lot when they look at modern art. I'm glad that you said that. We think, oh, they're just going to, throw it on. Not the case. I guess it was sort of like according to the individual artist in a way.
Absolutely, a method to the madness. All right, shall we proceed to work
Sure.
number 3?
Yes, so that's 1962 with spacious. Oh, before we leave, Sarah, you asked the question to me. Do you find this a spacious moment? What is your feeling when you look at this? And it's a happening for me of some kind. Like I said, sort of like an icon or a stained glass window in a way. So spacious moment, a moment of expansion, very subjective, very private. Yes, I think it's a great title.
Absolutely, you can certainly see the moment in
Yeah.
it. I was stuck on the title for a little bit actually because my first impression didn't feel spacious. It felt crowded and busy to me, but I think your thought of looking at it like a stained glass window, it's almost a lens for what's beyond it, and I think that's a wonderful way of interpreting the title.
Lovely work.
All right. So here we have a very interesting piece by Alice Crawford titled The
I
Hallway.
wonder whether those two paintings.
Oops, sorry, say that again.
This is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorites in the group. I was going to say for the others, I was wondering if the two Wilts came from the same collector, donor from Glacier Hills. Probably not, but I'm just wondering.
I actually don't have any record of how those two pieces made their way into Glacier Hills. So I know that Richard Wilt was very generous with his artwork, and it made its way to a lot of different individuals. So I think it's entirely possible they came independently to Glacier Hills, but it could be a big fan brought them both in at one time. So that's something I would love to get to the bottom of at one point, but so far I haven't had any luck. All right, so Alice Crawford here is another local Ann Arbor artist. And I've actually included here, I found this little clipping from the Ann Arbor News. This was a photograph of her at work in her studio. And she was very well known for doing all of the sets for the Ann Arbor Civic Theater for decades.
Wow.
And so she said that her artwork was her private self-expression and the set pieces were what she did for a crowd. So I hope she wouldn't mind us all gathering to take a look at this piece that she did.
This is one of my favorites in our group, I think, today, Sarah. I like this one very much. The colors, the architecture of this piece. I mean, it's very straightforward, of course, but I think what you said, well, I'm going to let you say it because there's a border around something. And I think you brought up a very, very good point about this.
Absolutely. So here you see two figures here, one in the foreground and one in the background. And it's almost like this foreground figure is peeking around a corner in the hallway to kind of take a, take a glance at what's happening in the background. And my first impression was that this was a doorway into another better lit space. And but I also took a look right at the bottom of that kind of pink rectangle with the second figure there. You see
Yes.
there's some kind of step up, and it doesn't sit flush with the ground the way a doorway normally might. So it made me think, is this maybe a mirror, or is this something hanging on the wall? I pointed out in this next slide here that there's a lot of repetition of form between the two figures and even the lamp sitting there on the
Yeah.
table. And so it made me wonder, are these two different people? Are they the same person, you know, sneaking a peek in the mirror? It's very interesting and very intriguing.
It's beautiful. I mean, what you think you're looking down a hallway past the woman on the left to someone else in another room, and that wonderful Dutch golden age effect that please describe. But then you realize, like you said, if you look at the bottom corner, that's really not a concave thing. It's not looking into a closet. Say that's a bump out. So the only real door, if there is one, is the one immediately by the figure in the foreground, and we're looking at essentially a mirror on a bump out. Where the actual second figure is, I don't really know. It doesn't seem to be the first figure, but you're right. It does look like a mirror to me. But I love the shapes. I love the repetition of the shapes, the fact that you pointed those out the way you did. I love the overall sense of African art that I get, maybe even Iberian art, when I see this. And I think that you had mentioned like the spirit spouse for the figure in the foreground. I totally agree. It does have that feeling. It has the idea of a talismanic statue that you would live with that does something for you, in a domestic kind of way that makes life better or heals something in some way.
Absolutely. And just to touch on the technique a little bit too, this detail I provided in the bottom left corner there, I thought was just a really interesting little facet of this piece. Most of it was applied with a paintbrush, but this little bit here, this kind of hatching and the lighter outline of the dark figure there is actually, the paint was applied and then the those lighter lines were actually etched out of the paint, kind of scraped away to reveal the light line work there, which I thought was just beautiful to look at. If you have a chance to walk past this at some point in the future, I recommend it because the textures and the unusual techniques there are really stunning to take a closer look at.
So she's actually scratched into the panel, or at least, her preparation for the panel is what we're seeing with that white.
Yes, and you mentioned the Dutch technique. I have it on the next slide here, so I can talk a bit about that.
Oh, wonderful.
So this is a 17th century Dutch tradition called door kijkje paintings, which I practiced saying in advance. But really just means a see-through door. And it's this tradition of painting an architectural space and including an open doorway in there so that you're able to kind of look past and into a mysterious further chamber of whatever space you're in, and it adds a bit of architectural intrigue and is often used in a really fun narrative way, because you can see just a little glimpse of something happening. It's almost out of view, but you get that little sneak peek into the interior world of this painting. And so the one on the left here is just a really clear example of a doorway version of this. And on the right, this Nicholas Moss piece, I thought kind of captured the spirit of the hallway, which we're discussing here. This
Absolutely.
eavesdropping servant here peeking around the corner at what looks like two young lovers slipping out of view there through the doorway. So there's a bit of fun and mischief happening
Absolutely.
there. And dramatic irony, something that young couple doesn't know about what's happening.
That
And
is that is wonderful.
I thought it captured the spirit, although I think the hallway is perhaps a little more ominous feeling, maybe less playful, but that feeling that one of these two figures doesn't necessarily know about the other one, and there's something kind of odd going on there.
Yes, yes, and whether there's some kind of tension there, or yeah, I think that's very interesting. I love your examples of the Hoogstraten and the Maes. When I look at the Nicholas Mays, I think of around the same time Velasquez Las Meninas.
Mm.
Where you look across the gallery where the artist is painting, and you have the Infanta and um, her attendants around her, and then coming in from mirrored from the back, you see the king and queen entering the room.
Mm.
So it's like, again, like a stained glass window in the stories that sometimes are depicted. One scene gives you multiple stories, and it's almost an archaic kind of thing. It's like what they'll do in Hollywood in the 60s, where they have split screen so you can see several things going on at the same time.
Mm.
You get that here. What a tour de force for an artist to be able to show his talent, to be able to give you this foreground, background, genre, everyday life meets still life, to be able to show their talents.
Absolutely. And I also included a few other comparisons here that, Ed, you actually mentioned in your first impressions of the piece here. So on the left, we have some caryatids, which are these kind of Greek, in place of a column, these female figures holding up a porch there. And also, as you already mentioned, the spirit spouse figures. So I'll let you talk about your impressions there, Ed, a little bit.
Well, why don't I start with the spirit spouse first? Wonderful story about the spirit spouse. The purpose of them is that, say, someone in your tribe is having adjustment problems, what we would call, they're having mental issues or something like that, and they're under stress. Maybe there's been a death in the family or something, and they're just keeping to themselves. They're not fitting in, which is very important with village life. Well, the shaman of the village will fashion this to get a spirit spouse figure. Say that there's been a loss of a spouse, or someone's feeling very, very lonely, that sort of thing.
Mm.
You give this, and the person takes care of it, lives with it, oils it, takes care of it. That's why it has that fabulous patina. But I've always thought of that as being a wonderful thing in a civilization where people are not discarded, say, because they're having problems, or because they're different. They're not let go. There is this way of assimilating them back gradually with village life by this proxy of the spirit spouse. And I think and this is an excellent example, what you chose, by the way. If a piece like this came up for auction, it would go well into the tens of thousands of dollars, and probably much more. I mean, I
Mm.
think a couple years ago, another record was set at Sotheby's, and I think that it was about $2 to $3 million, including the commission, for not a spirit spouse figure, but another standing figure like this, sort of a squatting figure. And the fact that it was a female figure, I think, made it even more desirable.
Mm.
Uh, but African art is now going through another renaissance again, as you know, and the audience probably know. To see a beautiful piece like this, you get that sense of, everybody in. We're not going to leave anybody behind. This guy's having a problem. I'm going to make this, and he's going to assimilate again back into us.
Mm.
You have anything you want to add about that before I go to the caryatids? I mean, it's such a beautiful example that you chose.
Absolutely. And this example is actually in our very own University of Michigan Museum of Art. So this is local and available for viewing once our museums are reopened to us again. But I thought it was a beautiful comparison you made to Crawford's The Hallway, just in the similarity of form and even that etching technique that we talked about. It
Yes.
reminds me of the scarification that they so beautifully illustrate in these spirit spouse figures there on the face and the forehead. So I thought it was a stunning comparison.
It is a wonderful, wonderful piece. Wonderful piece. And then with the caryatids there on the porch of the Erechtheum, I think all of us have seen this ever since we were kids in social studies and in history classes, and probably just amazed by that wonderful building on the Acropolis, built in the late 5th century BC, done on multiple levels. Sarah, as I understand it, because it's basically a hillside. It's kind of like looking at the houses by the Ark. You enter from one level, but the house goes back another floor behind. Well, that's what the Erechtheum is like. It's built on different levels. And this porch is a little bit above sort of the other entrance, and it has a wonderful view of the landscape from the Acropolis.
Mm.
And it's just a simple porch. I mean, this is just a small little area, not much bigger probably than your dining room table. But I mean, what more precious, beautifully proportioned um, extension of a building can you possibly think of? And as you said, the caryatids, they are acting as the columns. Considering the time, they might be Corinthian, they might be Ionic, but here they are. Look at the drapery. And again, you're saying scarification on the African figure. Look at what the drapery does here, a very, very similar type of effect. Look also how balanced everything is, holding up that entablature, how everything had to be balanced so perfectly down the neck through the body, basically where the arms are, the knee coming out, the drapery. All of that is eye candy for us and kind of disguises the architectural soundness of what is going on, of how that weight bearing is taking place. They are absolutely beautiful. And, just what a marvelous innovation from the golden age of Greek art in the 5th century.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of my favorite things about art too, is looking at one single piece, one painting, just brings to mind so many similar visual patterns from across history. So I thank you for bringing up these associations that you had when you first saw the piece.
Well, my pleasure. And I've got to think that Alice Crawford was thinking of this. I mean, they're so similar, Sarah,
Mm,
that she must have been thinking of African, Iberian, and certainly the Greek, tradition when she fashioned those figures in her painting.
absolutely. All right, shall we transition?
Sure.
All right, and I also apologize for any guest appearances by Langley the cat. she she thinks of herself as the 6th piece of artwork here, so.
Well, she steps very delicately behind you by
Yeah.
the window and on the chair.
So here we have a really lovely piece by another University of Michigan faculty artist who's working at the same time as all of those we've already discussed, William Lewis. And this is a really lovely watercolor representation of a view that might be familiar to you here in Ann Arbor. It's titled From Pontiac Trail 1920. So this was actually done in 1999, and based on my understanding of William Lewis's work, I think he probably did this from a historical photograph of this view. I think he spent a lot of time working with historic images and then translating them into his work. So he probably found this photograph from 1920 showing this look down the way toward, this is, you might be familiar with the area, Pontiac Trail approaching Broadway in Ann Arbor, and provided this beautiful snapshot. You can see Upper Town in the distance and some really lovely landmarks there. And I've actually included a few for comparison here. So this building here is the Anson Brown building, which is actually the oldest building still standing in the city of Ann Arbor. And
I think we froze just for a moment. There you go. Okay.
All better?
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, I had a little thing that the internet connection was unstable, so, but if you can hear me okay now, it's back to normal.
Yes,
Isn't
we're
that
back in
amazing?
business.
We're able to identify the Brown building.
Yeah, it has that really iconic Dutch architecture there with the little end bit. And so I've provided some photographs here just so you can compare. One is present day. It now holds a the St. Vincent de Paul store, which is a thrift store, I believe. And then a photograph also taken from 1930 of what it looked like. And so you can see over time, I think in the late 30s, they removed the 2 second stories of that building that in the painting features an advertisement for Gold Medal Flour.
Yes, yes, you're right. That's the adjacent, or really the attached building. Wow.
Yes, and I found some very interesting trivia about that building as well. I thought I would share just as a bit of Ann Arbor history. So Anson Brown was actually bound and determined. He was from New York State and moved to Ann Arbor, and he was determined that Lower Town, which is kind of this side of town with Broadway and Maiden Lane, he was determined that he would turn that into the epicenter of Ann Arbor rather than Upper Town, which became what's downtown now. And so he was waging a fierce battle of development and constructing all of these buildings there. And in the end, his fight was cut short by a cholera outbreak. And unfortunately, he passed away. And so his development on that side of town ceased. But this building here, the one that was shortened by 2 stories, also has its own interesting lore here. Let me pull up my notes. It's called the Edward L. Fuller Building. And in the 1860s, it housed Dr. Daniel B. Kellogg of the Kellogg family, who was known as the clairvoyant physician. And so out of this building, he would do his medical practice, and he claimed that he could go into a trance and see the organs of the body lit up without any kind of x-ray machine, and he could diagnose his patients that way. So all they needed to do was mail to him their name and their age, and of course the appropriate fee, and he would go into a trance and tell them what was ailing them.
You know, I've been looking for a practitioner like that for years. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, so I think William Lewis captured a building with some mysterious history here in this painting.
That's incredible. Now, do you know what happened to Dr. Kellogg by any chance? Did he leave under his own volition, or was he run out of town, or was he here for the rest of his life?
Actually, he continued his practice until his death, and then his son took over and became the new clairvoyant physician.
Oh my God.
And from there, I'm not sure what happened.
Bravo, sir. That's great research. What a story. I wonder why they cut it down. Probably for taxes, or maybe I don't know what. I know we're lucky though to keep the brown building at all, because a couple years ago there was a fire in the St. Vincent de Paul
Yeah,
that,
there was.
and luckily it didn't gut the building, you know. But it's the oldest building, the oldest commercial building in Ann Arbor from 1832 that's still standing?
Yes, I think not even commercial building. I think it might be the oldest, though I could be in error there, but my understanding is it's the oldest point blank in Ann Arbor.
Yeah. Oh, that's a, you know, the painting also is lovely, quite frankly. I think the way Lewis captures it. You know what painting I thought of when I looked at this? The treatment, the angle, the fact that we're on high ground with that sort of level distance effect to high ground in the distance.
Hmm.
Reminds me of the early George Inness painting, The Lackawanna Valley at the National Gallery. I think
Mm.
that's from about 1855. And it's a view on a hillside looking toward the city of Scranton. Not much of it there at that point in Pennsylvania. But basically, it was a corporate commission because the people paying for the painting, they wanted to have the painting of their new railroad roundhouse depicted. And they chose Innes, a great artist, but the wrong man for the job because he was so beguiled by the landscape, he minimized the roundhouse, and the train is chugging out of it. And you've got a denuded landscape of tree trunks and a boy looking like Tom Sawyer on the hillside, like chewing on grass, looking at the train, you know, in the distance. But the roundhouse was so small, the company refused to pay for the painting. And it was in kind of like a limbo for a while until the artist was able to claim it again. But you see that same kind of like almost a summer heat effect in the
Mm.
distance, like you see here on the hill in Scranton, and you get that same feeling here. You can almost feel the climate, you know, looking at this painting.
Yeah, it's beautifully atmospheric. It feels like you could step right back in time.
Yes. Yeah. You know what he did? He basically, if he owned the photograph, he probably would have colorized it. This was his way of colorizing a black and white. He just sort of duplicated it as a painting and gave it the color he wanted.
This is a very interesting piece here. This is by Fred Klein. It's called Glacier, and it is a lithograph print. And this piece gave me a double take when I saw it on the wall because I saw the name Klein signed on it, and I thought, well, I know of a very famous Klein, and somehow this doesn't seem like something that he would do, but I better make sure that we don't have a Klein hanging here unbeknownst to us at Glacier Hills. And so I did some research, and so this is actually by Fred or Fritz Klein, who is the father of internationally renowned Yves Klein, who would go on to be an incredibly famous experimental painter later in the 20th century.
That's right. His IKB 191 is incredible. Just that monochromatic blue, which he was so taken with and begins, you know, specializing in for a period of his work. He's considered, Yves is considered kind of like a bridge into pop art in a way. You know, that a lot of these artists didn't like the term minimalism, and we use that word a lot, Sarah, as you know. And because they didn't think there was anything really minimal about it at all with what they were trying to convey. And here you have the Klein, one of his Untitled. I mean, you just sort of lose yourself in the primary color. And what a fabulous, you know, fabulous artist when you see these icons basically well lit on a wall. You know, when I was at the National Gallery, I'll never forget a kind of a little boutique exhibition they did of Rothko, and they created a small little, almost like an apse in a church, small gallery for the smaller pieces, and they lit that so beautifully in there. It was like going into a chapel, and every one of those paintings seemed to have the light not shining, reflecting off of it, but coming from inside of it. It was a very spiritual experience, and you get a very similar experience from looking at Yves Klein's work. So this is the son, and then his father is represented in the Glacier Hills collection. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. Yes, so Yves was actually the son of two artists. Marie Raymond, I believe, yep, is the mother, and So Marie Raymond and Fritz Klein lived in a Dutch artist colony in the south of France while Eve was growing up. And so he was surrounded by art from a young age. So we can claim to have, I think, a little piece of influence in our Glacier Hills collection. And I actually read a really wonderful anecdote about how when Eve was young, he began to become interested in art, and so he asked his father to prepare a canvas for him to do some art on. And so Fred Klein painted the whole thing blue for him, so he could go on and do his painting on this prepared canvas. And so I would like to think that struck a chord with him.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. You know, one thing I'm thinking of too, when we look back at the Fritz Klein piece, you know, at Glacier Hills, the first thing that I looked at, that I noticed, was the beautiful celadon colored horse,
Mm.
right? And I immediately thought of the circus pictures of Picasso early in his career, relatively early in his career. Even more than that, I thought of Franz Marc as one of the, you know, Blau Reiter artists about 1910, 1911. He would die in World War I, in 1916. An incredible colorist, you know, where the sentimentality, where the narrative is completely gone, and you have these unrealistic colors. And again, the images of, say, wild horses in a forest. There's no real story to it at all. It becomes an icon of color. And I wonder whether or not, because of Fritz Klein, the father, and, you know, he would have been a contemporary to Franz Marc and the others, whether or not there is a sort of the Blau Reiter colors, the love of the primary colors, particularly blue, being picked up by Eve Klein later on. I wonder if there's some kind of prismatic effect that's going on that led to Eve Klein, the younger, the son, basically finding the colors again of German modernism of the turn of the 20th century. I wonder. That's probably totally spurious, but it just, you know, came to mind.
Absolutely. And, you know, Fred Klein was known too as a painter of light, kept being quoted over and over again. I think his contemporaries knew him as the painter of light. And I've also read that he was a very reverent towards the Impressionists and Monet. And so even as, you know, at the time he was working, the art scene was moving more towards constructivism and cubism, and he stayed true to the tenets of the Impressionists, and was extremely dedicated to, you know, the beautiful soft light and color there. And he's been quoted as saying that he never understood his son's work very much, which sounds very typical, I think, of a father-son artistic duo. So yeah, he remained far more traditional, even as the world was changing around him there. And I thought his devotion to the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists was interesting too, because of so many of these circus themes that we see coming from them. Sara and Toulouse-Lautrec in particular both did stunning representations of circus scenes with women on horses that, in my opinion, are a lot grittier and almost more grotesque than what Klein ended up doing. His was more like a Monet watercolor version of these post-impressionist pieces. It looks more like a carousel in Disneyland, in my opinion.
That's right. Yeah, this is almost like a kind of like a nighttime fantasy. In some ways, when you look at individual faces, particularly with the Lautrecs, almost a nightmare.
Yeah.
No, I think you're spot on with the Fritz Klein piece. You know, one thing about that, and just from your experience, Sara, too, that seems to be coloristically in marvelous condition. Quite frankly, that is a lithograph, but the colors seem all there. I mean, either this has, you know, UV, you know, glass or plexi, you know, there in the frame, or whether it just hasn't been in direct light or whatever, it's been well taken care of. Those colors are very, very vivid, and I'm surprised. I would expect a little bit more fading for something that's been on the walls.
Absolutely. I think it benefits from hanging in the corridor. I'm, again, like the wilt, I'm not sure when this went up on the walls or where exactly it came from, but it seems to have fared well. Just being in a corridor, it's on the end of the corridor and a bit of low light, you would almost overlook it. I don't think many people would even end up that far down unless they lived in the apartment right next door to it. So it's been beautifully preserved, and I'm so glad that it can maybe be brought out from that corner and shared with more people now.
It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. You know what work I also think of, Sarah, just looking at him in particular, the Dalmatian running beautifully and almost etherealized, you know, the bottom of the animal, but so, you know, unmistakably active and moving. That dog running, you know, alongside the horse with this performer, and whether or not the other woman is another performer or just a mirror image of the same, we don't know. But I thought of Durer's fabulous engraving, Night, Death, and the Devil, right, from 1513, where the dog is accompanying the knight through that valley of darkness with all the dangers and temptations along the way, and he's just looking straight on toward his object, right? But he's accompanied by his faithful dog, who's actually running between his horse and the really sort of like broken down horse that I think Time is astride of, looking at him. It's a very, very narrow, cramped place. And you get that same liveliness on the part of that dog by Dürer as we see here by Klein. It's a secondary, you know, element to the painting or to the print, but I think it's beautifully done.
Absolutely. They all kind of emerge together, and it's very lively. There's a lot of action there, and yet it almost looks like they're floating on clouds too. So it's really
Yes.
stunning.
Wow. I'm just amazed all the time, Sarah, of just the beauty that is there at Glacier Hills, the breadth of the collection, how representative it is of our local artists and teaching faculty. I mean, like Hans Hofmann, these were people who are not only great with a brush on their own, they were great teachers too. And not everybody who's an artist makes a good teacher, but we're very, very lucky to have so many who were at the University of Michigan, and they're represented on the walls there at Glacier Hills. A lovely resource, just a wonderful resource for the residents there and the staff.
Absolutely. It's a really beautiful collection, and it's always a treat to get to do a deeper dive on some of these pieces and find out even more secrets that are kind of hidden on the walls around campus. So I hope that everyone will, once it's safe to do so, take that handout that I provided in the Art Digest that has the thumbnail photographs of these pieces and where you can find them on campus, and go and take a look yourselves in person, because of course a screen can never do justice to a piece of art. So when it's possible, I hope you'll all go and check them out in person. All right.
Well, this has been just a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to the management of Glacier Hills, and thank you all the residents there. Can't wait to be able to come back in that beautiful auditorium again, where we sort of do a Phil Donahue. You're at the podium, I'm walking around, and just taking the questions and that, and it makes art, I think, you know, it gives it an environment that it should have, where it's really part of a lively discussion. And what could be better, where you're actually living in a place and you see art you become familiar with. It's like getting to know a person. You just don't look at it one time, you get to know it over a long period of time. But well, this sequestration will end at some point, and can't wait to be able to come back again. So this was just a lot of fun, Sarah. Thank you for all your work, boy, all your research and everything to make this Zoom meeting work like this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed, for joining me and providing your wonderful insights and expertise. It's always a pleasure to do this, and I'm glad that we were able to make it happen, even in unusual circumstances here. And so I hope that this presentation will bring a little bit of joy to all of you residents watching along in your apartments. And I look very much forward to the time when I can return to campus and join you all again, and we can continue to celebrate the beautiful collection of art.